Before the word feminism existed, before equality was considered a demand, there was Mary Wollstonecraft. She did not inherit power. She did not rule, command armies, or sit on a throne. Her authority came from something far less forgivable, she thought, and she wrote what she thought plainly. In an age that praised reason but denied it to women, she insisted that women were not ornaments, not moral assistants, not creatures of feeling alone, but rational beings. For this, she was not remembered as a philosopher. She was remembered as a problem. Her ideas were called dangerous. Her tone was called inappropriate. Her private life was used to discredit her public thought. And long after her death, her work was reduced, softened, or ignored, while the world quietly adopted parts of it. This is not the story of a woman who was ahead of her time. It is the story of a world that refused to meet her where she stood. This is not a celebration. It is not a simplification. And it is not a biography that asks for admiration. It is an attempt to listen, to a voice that spoke clearly before society was ready to hear it. She was born into a household where authority existed without responsibility. Her father drank, failed, and ruled. His anger carried weight. His mistakes did not. The family moved repeatedly, chasing stability that never arrived. Each move confirmed the same lesson. Security was fragile, and for women, conditional. Inside the home, power was not debated. It was assumed. What happened there was private, and what was private was untouchable. There were no protections designed for daughters, no language for injustice, only expectations, quiet, persistent, and unequal. This was not an unusual childhood. It was a common one. 18th century, society treated male authority as natural and female endurance as virtue. A man's violence could be explained. A woman's suffering was required. Mary learned early that power did not depend on wisdom or restraint. It depended on permission. She did not grow up imagining men as guardians. She saw what authority looked like when it faced no resistance. She noticed how men were excused for failure and how women were trained to absorb its consequences. The pattern repeated often enough to feel permanent. Women were described as dependent by nature, delicate, emotional, in need of guidance. Yet Mary's experience contradicted this story. Dependence was not a biological condition. It was produced, maintained through money, through marriage, and through silence. Women were not prepared to reason. They were prepared to comply. In such a world, speech was dangerous. Attention was safer. Mary learned to watch, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. When speaking brings punishment, observation becomes intelligence. She watched authority protect itself. She watched obedience rewarded. She watched how adjustment was praised while resistance was pathologized. At this stage, she did not yet have philosophy. She had not yet read the texts that would later shape her arguments. But a question had already formed, quietly and persistently. Why was authority assumed to be male? And why was suffering expected to be female? She did not begin her life trying to change the world. She began by trying to understand it. What revealed itself was not individual cruelty, but structure. A system that confused control with virtue and submission with morality. A system that called endurance goodness and called questioning danger. Equality did not arrive in her mind as an ideal. It arrived as a need, as the absence of safety, as the realization that dignity was unevenly distributed and deliberately so. This understanding did not immediately make her defiant. It made her alert, and that alertness, sharpened over time, would become the foundation of everything she later wrote. Education was never presented to women as a path forward. It was framed as a risk. In 18th century England, the idea of an educated woman provoked unease. Knowledge was not considered neutral. It was believed to reshape character, ambition, and obedience. For men, this transformation was desirable. For women, it was dangerous. Women were taught just enough to function within society, but never enough to question it. Reading was permitted when it encouraged piety or obedience. Writing was tolerated when it remained decorative. Thinking, however, was seen as excess. Reason, when exercised by women, was treated as deviation rather than capacity. Mary Wollstonecraft encountered this boundary early. She understood that education was not withheld because women were incapable, but because they were expected to remain dependent. An educated woman would require fewer guardians. She would be harder to manage. She would notice contradictions. Mary began educating herself not as an act of rebellion, but as a means of survival. Books offered structure where her life did not. They provided consistency, language, and a sense of order absent from her domestic world. Reading was not leisure, it was preparation. She observed how girls were trained to become agreeable rather than capable. They were praised for beauty, modesty, and compliance. Their intellectual curiosity was redirected toward refinement. Education was reduced to polish. Knowledge became ornament. Mary rejected this logic quietly at first. She read seriously. She thought rigorously. She treated reason not as a masculine trait, but as a human one. This was her first true divergence from expectation. Teaching became one of the few socially acceptable ways for women to engage with knowledge. Mary taught not because it was ideal, but because it was possible. Teaching was labor, not privilege. It offered income, limited autonomy, and proximity to books. It also revealed the full extent of the problem. Girls were not being prepared for independence. They were being prepared for dependence disguised as virtue. What disturbed society was not that women might learn facts. It was that they might learn to judge. An educated woman could compare what she was told with what she observed. She could recognize inconsistency. She could identify injustice without needing it explained. Mary began to understand education as a political issue, even before she framed it as one. The denial of education was not neglect, it was design. A system that required women to remain childlike could not afford for them to mature intellectually. She did not yet write publicly about this, but the foundation was forming. Education, she realized, was not simply about knowledge. It was about autonomy. And autonomy, for women, was precisely what society feared most. This fear would follow her. It would shape how her ideas were received. And it would eventually define the resistance she faced, not because she was wrong, but because she was clear. Writing was not a declaration of confidence. It was a necessity. For Mary Wollstonecraft, entering the public world of ideas did not come with permission. It came with risk. Writing was one of the few forms of labor available to women that did not require marriage, patronage, or submission to a household. It offered income, but it also exposed her voice, her thoughts, her judgments to a society that did not expect women to speak authoritatively. The public sphere was not designed to receive women as thinkers. It tolerated them as muses, as moral examples, or as curiosities. But when women wrote with clarity and argument, they were treated as intrusions. Their work was not evaluated on its merit alone. It was filtered through expectations about gender, propriety, and tone. Mary wrote anyway. She began with reviews, essays, translations, forms considered marginal enough to allow entry. Writing was work before it was recognition. She wrote to support herself, not to build a reputation. This distinction mattered. Economic independence gave her proximity to ideas, but not protection from judgment. Respectability was fragile. A woman who wrote too much, too seriously, or too boldly risked being labeled improper. Mary lived under this pressure constantly. Every sentence carried a secondary evaluation, not only whether it was correct, but whether it was acceptable for a woman to say it. Her presence unsettled expectations. She wrote with reason, not deference. She did not soften her arguments to appear agreeable. She did not present intelligence as an exception. She assumed it. This assumption was interpreted as arrogance. Male writers were granted complexity. They were allowed contradiction, ambition, and intellectual aggression. Mary was expected to remain contained. When she did not, her confidence was reframed as defiance, her clarity as hostility. Yet writing offered something no other space did: permanence. Spoken words could be dismissed, written words remained. Once published, they could not be quietly erased. They circulated, provoked response, and demanded engagement. Mary understood this power. She did not write to shock. She wrote to argue. Her sentences were structured, deliberate, and restrained. The threat was not her emotion, it was her logic. As she continued to publish, she became increasingly visible and increasingly scrutinized. Her ideas were debated, but so was her character. The boundary between intellectual critique and personal judgment blurred quickly. This was not accidental. Discrediting the woman made it easier to dismiss the argument. Still, she persisted. Writing allowed Mary Wollstonecraft to exist publicly without apology. It gave form to the questions she had carried since childhood. It transformed private observation into shared reasoning. Through writing, she claimed space, not as a representative of women, but as a thinking individual. This was the moment she crossed a threshold. She was no longer only learning or observing, she was intervening, and intervention, once begun, cannot remain neutral. The French Revolution promised a world rebuilt on reason. Liberty, equality, and universal rights became the language of a new political imagination. Old hierarchies were questioned. Monarchies fell. The authority of tradition appeared suddenly fragile. For many thinkers across Europe, this moment suggested that history itself could be corrected. Mary Wollstonecraft believed briefly that this language might mean what it claimed. She supported the revolution not because it was violent, but because it was rational in its aspiration. A society governed by reason, she believed, would have no justification for inherited privilege or arbitrary authority. If rights were truly universal, they could not stop at gender. But the test came quickly. As revolutionary ideals moved from theory into practice, their limits became visible. Declarations of universal rights were written by men and applied to men. Equality was celebrated in speeches while women were instructed to remain silent. The public sphere expanded, but only selectively. Women marched, organized, wrote, and debated. They participated in the revolution as citizens in all but name. Yet when they demanded recognition, they were accused of excess. Political engagement that was praised in men was condemned in women as disorder. Mary watched this contradiction unfold in real time. The same thinkers who argued passionately against tyranny defended female exclusion without hesitation. Reason, they insisted, belonged to men. Women, they claimed, were governed by emotion and therefore unsuited to citizenship. Enlightenment ideals, when tested, revealed an unexamined boundary. The revolution did not fail women accidentally. It excluded them deliberately. Mary understood that this exclusion was not a betrayal of revolutionary logic, but a continuation of social design. Equality was imagined as universal, only as long as it did not threaten existing power relations. The moment women asked to be included, the language of rights became cautious, conditional, and evasive. She did not respond with despair. She responded with clarity. Mary argued that reason could not be selectively distributed without collapsing its own authority. If rationality justified political rights, then denying those rights to women required proving that women lacked reason itself. This was a claim no serious thinker could sustain honestly. The violence of the revolution disturbed her, but the hypocrisy disturbed her more. A movement that claimed to dismantle arbitrary power had simply redrawn its borders. Kings were replaced, structures remained. This realization sharpened her thinking. It clarified the task ahead. The struggle was not only against monarchs or institutions, but against assumptions so deeply embedded that even revolutions carried them forward intact. The French Revolution did not radicalize Mary Wollstonecraft. It refined her. It revealed that progress could be proclaimed without being practiced, and that equality, when left undefined, would always be distributed unevenly. The language of rights, she learned, was powerful, but only if someone insisted on its full meaning, and she was prepared to insist. She did not write A Vindication of the Rights of Woman to provoke. She wrote it because the contradictions had become impossible to ignore. The Enlightenment spoke constantly of reason. It praised rational thought as the foundation of morality, politics, and progress. Yet the same thinkers who celebrated reason insisted that women were governed by feeling. This claim was repeated so often that it passed as fact, despite the absence of evidence. Mary Wollstonecraft refused this premise. Her argument was direct. If reason was the basis of virtue, then excluding women from education did not protect morality, it undermined it. A society that demanded virtue from women while denying them the tools to cultivate. It was not moral, it was inconsistent. She did not argue that women were superior. She did not claim moral purity or emotional insight as compensation for exclusion. She argued something far more unsettling, that women were ordinary human beings, capable of reason, improvement, and error, and therefore entitled to the same intellectual development as men. This position was received as radical precisely because it was not sentimental. Mary rejected the ideal of femininity that defined women as gentle, dependent, and decorative. She insisted that this ideal did not elevate women. It weakened them. Trained to please rather than to think, women were encouraged to remain childlike. Dependence was mistaken for virtue. Ignorance was reframed as innocence. She exposed this logic without hesitation. Women, she argued, were not naturally inferior. They were made so through neglect. Education had been withheld deliberately. Then the consequences of that deprivation were cited as proof of incapacity. The argument sustained itself by design. Her writing unsettled readers because it refused compromise. She did not soften her conclusions to appear agreeable. She did not appeal to male benevolence. She appealed to consistency. If society claimed to value reason, it could not deny it to half the population without collapsing its own justification. The response was swift and defensive. Critics did not primarily engage with her arguments. They questioned her tone. They questioned her character. They warned that educated women would disrupt households, challenge husbands, and abandon their duties. These anxieties revealed the true fear, not that women would become immoral, but that they would become autonomous. Mary anticipated these reactions. She addressed them directly. Education, she argued, would not destroy families. It would strengthen them. Partnerships built on reason and respect would replace those built on obedience. Marriage would become a relationship between equals rather than a hierarchy, disguised as affection. This was not merely a social proposal. It was a structural challenge, a vindication of the rights of woman did not ask society to feel differently about women. It demanded that society think differently. It required readers to confront the cost of their assumptions. And it made clear that denying women education was not tradition, it was policy. The book did not offer comfort, it offered clarity. In doing so, Mary Wollstonecraft crossed a point of no return. She had moved beyond observation, beyond participation, beyond commentary. She had named the system itself, and once named, it could no longer be ignored. She was permitted to write as long as she appeared disciplined by reason. But when her private life became visible, the permission ended. Mary Wollstonecraft's ideas were controversial, but her relationships were treated as evidence. What men were allowed to experience as complexity, women were forced to justify as character. Love, for a woman who thought publicly, was never neutral. It was either proof of weakness or confirmation of guilt. Mary did not live cautiously. She believed emotional honesty was not a defect to be hidden, but part of a complete human life. This belief, harmless in men, was unforgivable in women. Her attachments, her disappointments, and her vulnerability were observed with a level of scrutiny that her male contemporaries never faced. When her relationships faltered, the response was not sympathy, it was judgment. Her emotional pain was reframed as instability. Her openness was recast as irresponsibility. The same society that tolerated male excess demanded female restraint. This was the double standard at work. A woman could argue rationally only if she lived flawlessly. Mary understood this pressure. She also refused to submit to it. She did not disguise her emotional life to preserve intellectual credibility. She rejected the idea that reason required the absence of feeling. To her, the two were not opposites. They were incomplete without each other. Marriage, when it finally came, was not an escape from scrutiny. It was a brief alignment of values. With William Godwin, she found respect rather than control. Their relationship challenged convention not through spectacle, but through structure, partnership instead of hierarchy, equality instead of guardianship. But even this did not protect her. After her death, her life was reopened and rearranged for public consumption. Details that had never invalidated male thinkers were elevated into defining features. Her arguments were pushed aside. Her private letters were read as confessions. Her intellectual legacy was filtered through her emotional experiences. This was not accidental. It was punishment. By reframing Mary Wollstonecraft as a cautionary tale, society neutralized her ideas without refuting them. Her thought was not disproven. It was pathologized. The woman became the argument against the work. Yet this strategy revealed its own weakness. If ideas could only be dismissed by attacking the life of the person who voiced them, then the ideas themselves remained intact. Mary's vulnerability was never evidence of irrationality. It was evidence of humanity. What unsettled her critics was not her emotional life, but her refusal to separate it from her intellect. She would not choose between feeling and thinking. She insisted on both. This insistence came at a cost, but it also clarified the stakes. A society that demands perfection from women who think does not fear imperfection. It fears independence, and Mary Wollstonecraft had already claimed it. Death did not end Mary Wollstonecraft's struggle. It transformed it. She died young, exhausted by childbirth, and weakened by a body that had carried far more than it was ever protected from. Her death was quiet. There was no public reckoning, no acknowledgement of the intellectual weight she had carried. What remained was her work and the question of how it would be remembered. That question was answered quickly. Those closest to her believed they were acting honestly. William Godwin published a memoir that revealed her private life in full detail. He intended transparency. He believed truth would honor her. What he underestimated was how eagerly society would use intimacy as a weapon. Her ideas were no longer debated on their own terms. They were reframed through her personal experiences. Her relationships became evidence. Her emotions became explanations. Her intellectual authority was reduced to biography. Male thinkers had long been forgiven for contradiction. Their flaws were described as depth, their excesses as genius. Mary Wollstonecraft was not granted this generosity. What had once been called clarity was now labeled instability. What had been courage was reframed as recklessness. Her reputation collapsed faster than her ideas could travel. For decades, her name became shorthand for danger, not because her arguments were refuted, but because they were inconvenient. It was easier to warn women away from her life than to confront her logic. Silence proved more efficient than censorship. Her work did not disappear. It circulated quietly. It was referenced indirectly. Its conclusions were absorbed, softened, and repeated, often without her name attached. The system learned how to use her ideas while distancing itself from her as a person. This was not accidental forgetting, it was strategic erasure. Mary Wollstonecraft became a figure people knew about without knowing. Her arguments survived, but her authority did not. Her presence was reduced to a footnote, her work to a prelude, her name to a cautionary example. Yet erasure is never complete. The very persistence of her ideas revealed their strength. They could be ignored, delayed, or misattributed, but not undone. Each generation that returned to questions of education, equality, and reason found her waiting, already having articulated what others were still struggling to name. Her silence after death was imposed, not earned. History did not forget her because she was wrong. It forgot her because she was difficult to contain. And in that silence, something else became clear. Ideas do not require their authors to survive, but justice does. Her name faded. Her ideas did not. For decades after her death, Mary Wollstonecraft was rarely cited with respect. When she was mentioned at all, it was cautiously, often as a warning rather than a source. Her arguments circulated without attribution. Her conclusions appeared in new texts, softened, rephrased, detached from their origin. This was how her influence survived quietly. As the 19th century unfolded, debates about women's education, moral agency, and citizenship intensified. The language evolved, but the core questions remained unchanged. Could women reason? Should they be educated beyond usefulness to men? Were they capable of independence without social collapse? Again and again, the answers echoed arguments Mary had already made. Educational reformers insisted that women required intellectual training to become moral adults. Political thinkers argued that rights could not rest on strength alone. Early feminists questioned marriage as hierarchy rather than partnership. These ideas appeared progressive, even radical, yet their foundations were already laid. Mary Wollstonecraft was rarely named, but she was present. Her work functioned as a buried framework. It shaped discussions that claimed novelty while relying on her logic. This absence was not accidental. To acknowledge her fully would have required confronting why she had been dismissed in the first place. History found it easier to separate ideas from their author. When women began organizing publicly, demanding access to education and legal reform, Mary's arguments resurfaced with renewed clarity. What had once been labeled dangerous now appeared reasonable. What had been dismissed as excessive now seemed restrained. Time had not changed her ideas. It had changed the audience. Her influence extended beyond political theory. It reached into literature, pedagogy, and philosophy. Writers who explored female autonomy, moral development, and resistance to prescribed roles echoed her insistence that women were not incomplete men, nor moral symbols, but full human beings. Even her daughter's work carried traces of this legacy. The question of responsibility, creation, and ethical consequence, central to Mary's thinking, reappeared in new forms, embedded in fiction rather than philosophy. This delayed recognition revealed something uncomfortable. Progress often depends on voices it refuses to credit. Ideas are welcomed only after their originators are safely distant. Mary Wollstonecraft did not fail to shape history. History failed to acknowledge its debt, and yet her influence endured precisely because it was grounded in reason rather than momentary approval. She did not argue for attention. She argued for coherence. That coherence could be postponed but not erased. By the time her name was slowly reclaimed, her ideas had already done their work. They had waited. She was not wrong. She was early. History often describes figures like Mary Wollstonecraft as being ahead of their time. This phrase sounds generous, but it hides a refusal. It suggests inevitability, as if society would have arrived at the same conclusions on its own. With or without her, it would not have. Mary Wollstonecraft did not predict the future. She argued with the present. She looked directly at the values her society claimed to hold: reason, virtue, equality, and asked why those values stopped short of women. She did not demand admiration. She demanded coherence. And coherence, more than rebellion, is what power resists. Her life never fit the narrative that history prefers. She was not rewarded for patience. She was not softened by time. She was not redeemed by conformity. Instead, she remained difficult. She insisted that women were not symbols of morality, but moral agents. Not companions to reason, but participants in it. Not exceptions to humanity, but fully included within it. For this insistence, she paid a price. She was criticized when she lived, discredited when she died, and selectively remembered when her ideas became unavoidable. Yet this delay does not diminish her work. It clarifies it. Progress does not begin when society agrees. It begins when someone speaks clearly despite knowing they will not be welcomed. Mary Wollstonecraft did not wait for permission. She did not ask to be understood. She wrote as if reason itself were enough, and in the end it was. Her legacy is not found in monuments or slogans. It exists in questions that refuse to disappear, in arguments that resurface whenever equality is declared but unequally applied, in every moment where rights are described as universal and someone asks for whom. She did not imagine a better world. She described one, precisely and without apology, and left it there, unfinished, waiting. Not because it was flawed, but because the world was slow, too early, not wrong.